I'm going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Jake Manske, here to talk about using dynamic SQL in your code. Before we hop into that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself here first. If I can get this to work. So I have a PhD in mathematics, which I got in 2010. I can't believe that was 10 years ago now. Was a mathematics faculty member until 2013 when I realized you can't really make a whole lot of money in academics. So I decided to become a developer instead. I've been working with SQL Server for a little over 7 years now. I work for Epic, which is an EHR analytics vendor in Madison, Wisconsin. I don't work on the like the healthcare part. I work on the analytics part. In particular, I work on our data warehouse product. The thing that I specialize in really is moving lots of data from one place to another really fast and accurately. We've got some pretty big customers with some pretty high demands, and especially as you can imagine this pandemic going on right now, being able to understand data from the healthcare system and get data out so you can make some conclusions based on what's going on is really important right now. So that's what I work on. My pedigree doesn't have any of these fancy MVP, Microsoft certified master stuff in it, but I will tell you that my pedigree, at least for writing dynamic SQL, is that a large portion of our ETL process is written in T-SQL. And for a lot of that, we need to write dynamic SQL. So I personally am responsible for tens of thousands of lines of dynamic SQL in production systems that are mission critical systems. So that's where my know-how for writing dynamic SQL comes from. You can find me on Twitter at jmansky. You can email me if that is something that floats your boat as well. You can find my blog there. Write some stuff that is interesting to me. I haven't written a lot recently. I feel like I need to go back and just start writing stuff that I need to remember. I found myself asking a lot of questions on Twitter that no one has an answer for. So I feel like I need to blog about them, maybe. I don't know. As we go along here, I don't know who's fielding questions or what. I don't know what's going on with this GoToMeeting. I only see like a couple of people on here. So if there are others in some other audience and they need to interrupt.
No, I'll explain. Yeah, okay. So we have you and we have the FoxPass leadership on GoToMeeting, and then I'm streaming it over to Twitch. So if we have any questions, Josh is looking at Twitch and he'll interrupt and ask the question. So they can just kind of chat in. So anyone listening, if you want to chat in for any questions, we'll ask Jake here.
Okay, great. Yeah, that works for me. Anyways, going to talk a little bit about dynamic SQL today, just some sort of like lessons learned and things that you should know. Around the time that I was developing this talk, about 6 months ago or so, Erland Sommerskog rewrote his sort of, I don't really want to call it like the Bible, but it's sort of like, here are the rules for dynamic SQL blog post. And I'll link that at the end. So anything here that you think I might be like rehashing from his blog is either because he's right or I independently discovered it or something like that. Like his blog post is amazing. Definitely a great place. Definitely a great resource. I'll link that at the end. Just want to give credit where credit's due, of course. So what is dynamic SQL and why would I use it? Basically, when you need code to write other code, right? Some of us are developers, not all of us are developers, especially if we're DBAs and we're just trying to write some agent job somewhere that maybe just runs some stored procedure, something like that. You don't really have the power to write CLR maybe. You have to write stuff into SQL and you're going to have it run in the database, but it needs to sort of write its write itself as it runs. It's not something where you know the answer at design time. You're only going to know the answer at runtime. So things like you don't know exactly what the query is going to be until you have to run it. So like if you're trying to check whether, you know, an index is fragmented, you don't know what index you're going to want to check until that you're going to run that code, right? So you might need to write dynamic SQL to check that particular index for fragmentation. Or if you're checking for some out-of-date stats, right? If you don't know the table at the time, you have to pass the table as a parameter. Well, as we all know, like you can't use parameters that way in SQL code. So how are we going to get around that? So that's where dynamic SQL comes in. It's a very powerful tool. It's very easy to abuse and do wrong, which is why you might see a lot of people in the industry say things like you should never use dynamic SQL, or you see, you know, people make comics that are like, oh, I didn't sanitize my database inputs. This thing is broken now. Like, yes, almost anything that exists can be used for evil and used poorly and used wrong. Okay. So don't listen to them as a blanket statement. Don't ever write dynamic SQL. Write dynamic SQL when you have to write dynamic SQL. Do not write it when you don't have to. Like that is pretty much where I live. It is, you know, by those two maxims right there. So when you need code to write other code, what am I talking about? I mentioned a couple things earlier. I'm talking about like maintenance job, update statistics, rebuild indexes, kind of anything you can't use parameters for. So just not like a straight query where I'm going to like, you know, say, oh, give me something where the user ID is, you know, something that the end user gets to plug in, right? You might have to look at a different table or a different statistic or a different index. So, or if you want to write a query that has different filters depending on different inputs, because you've seen people like my friend Eric Darling especially has a lot of these really nice bite-sized vlogs that you can go watch, where he talks about how to, you know, write a query that is sort of one of these catch-all queries, but that doesn't have the wrong thing in it at the wrong time. That's one of his examples for the right way to use dynamic SQL. So I'm not going to go over that again here, but that's another great example. So we talk a little bit about best practices here. After I do a bunch of demos so that everybody knows what I'm talking about. So again, please everybody bear with me here. I am using the trackpad on this laptop and it is not good. So I'm going to do my best with this and not complain too much, but if something I'm doing is messed up, then please let me know. So I got to move some of this stuff out of the way. This GoToMeeting stuff is blocking me. I don't know how to minimize this. Sorry, 1 second, everybody.
We can't see it on our end, so, but if it does block your work, I understand.
Yeah, there are these weird windows that are blocking stuff. So I can't like see everything I need to see. Yeah. I wonder if I can do this. So close that, hide everyone. Good. Okay. Appear to be able to drag these things around. You probably can't see what I'm doing, but trust me, it's amazing. Oh, good, finally. Hey, there we go. Okay. Okay. Oh, doctor, where are we at here? Okay. Can you see what I just did? Is that coming through?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. All right. So anyways, I am going to run us through some demos here to sort of explain why someone would use dynamic SQL, see some pitfalls, and understand what our problems might be if we're using it the wrong way. Right here, this is just me showing you what I'm working with for these demos. I got 2019 CU1. I know it's kind of old at this point. And there are some bugs in CU1 that have been fixed, but I'm not doing anything that relies on CU1 specifically. I just want to make it totally clear what I'm using. So I am going to show you first an example of, oh man, come on, where is this thing? We don't need this. Do need this. Okay, so, suppose for a moment I'm a DBA, I want to have a store procedure that's gonna, given a table, is gonna loop through and update all the statistics on that table with full scan. So you could imagine some situation where I have some nightly maintenance job or something that runs right after my ETL maybe, that goes through and updates the statistics where necessary so that end users trying to query these tables don't have to wait for stats updates. Or I know for a fact I've got some tables that are very sensitive to statistics being up to date. You might be trying to avoid like the ascending key issue on certain columns and certain tables. You've determined that this is something that you want to do. Okay, so you've also determined that you're going to just update with full scan because you don't want to live in a world where this is not, you don't want to live in a world where your stats are out of date, basically. And you're going to eat that cost during your maintenance window. You're not going to deal with it, using auto stats updates and things like that. I got to get rid of something here quick. Sorry about that. Don't look at that. Anyways, okay, so here we are. So we just got some query. It's a cursor. Goes through, given that table, just loops through everything in sys.stats for that table. And then I got to build some update statistics statements. So I build it like this, right? Got some nvarchar variable that I'm going to put some code into, update statistics, table name, left parenthesis, stat name, right parenthesis with full scan. I have this debug flag, which is just, helpful for me. If I want to, instead of running this code, see what the code would run, I could do that. Otherwise, it'll just execute that code and it goes to the next stat and does that same thing. So it's a pretty simple stored procedure here. Nothing too crazy. Very basic and a pretty good first attempt. Like there's no reason to believe that this doesn't work. So let's go over here. Again, I'm using the Stack Overflow database. So I just want to remind us all what is in this comments table is just comments from posts on Stack Overflow. If you use Stack Overflow for anything, if you're a developer, I'm sure you have. It can be a job saver in some cases. Anyways, this is the format of the table. You got some bogus ID column that means nothing, creation date, post ID, score, text, and the user who left the comment, right? So to satisfy queries on the table, SQL Server will automatically create stats on some of the columns, and we can see that with a query here that I've written. Right, we see that this particular table, the comments table, has a stat on PK comments ID, right? So that's the primary key index, just has that ID in it. And then there's this weirdly named thing, is the name of the statistics object, and it's on the score column. So that might have been automatically created because someone in the past or recently has issued some query that was like, I want all the queries where the score is bigger than 100 points, something like that. So it builds this statistics object here. Does anyone in the audience for bonus points know what this prefix WA is for on those automatically generated statistics objects?
It might be a bit of a lag with Twitch, so we'll see what Josh has to say.
Oh, how exciting.
Suspension builds.
The suspension is building. No takers? The WA stands for Washington because that's where Redmond is, because that's where Microsoft headquarters is. So I guess when they were doing the initial development for these auto stats creation, they were like, well, we got to give them a name. Let's say with underscore WA, because surely nobody's creating stats called underscore WA something. You know, it's stuff like this. It just reminds me, Microsoft is just a software shop like anybody else. They might have a lot more money than the software shop you or I work for, but you still got people making decisions like that, and naming things is hard. So, I'm not going to fault them too much. Anyways, we've got this maintenance job. It's going to update stats. I'm going to try it first with the debug flag on, just so we can see what we would run. We see here update statistics on comments table with full scan. And if we actually run it, we can see something happen here. We wait a little bit. Okay, it took about 10 seconds or so. I got another little stored procedure here that I wrote that's just going to show me, properties about those statistics. You can look at that code later if you want to, but you can see I just ran that code. We see that it just updated. It is indeed 1824 hours, right? It's nearly 6:30, so we see something happened here just recently. So indeed, my thing is working. Fantastic, right? Now, is our stored procedure resilient, right? Like, what if a new stat is created that doesn't exactly follow our expectations, right? So I'm going to create a new statistics on creation date. I'm going to call it my great statistic. I'm just doing with sample 0 rows so that it doesn't take any time to create. And then what happens when I try to run this code? I'm going to loop through these stats again and update them. Right. Fantastic. Incorrect syntax near great. Incorrect syntax near keyword with. Right. So what does this mean? Like, what is happening? Okay. And herein lies part of the problem with writing dynamic SQL. Sometimes you get these errors that don't really make a whole lot of sense to you, right? If I don't know that somebody created some wacky statistic called my great statistic, if I got this error message, my first thought is going to be like, what? Right? Incorrect syntax near great. I know I didn't write any code that has the word great in it. That's kind of insane, right? So what is happening? So our problem is that statistic was in a format that we weren't really expecting, right? The problem was that there were spaces in that name. So I'm going to run this with the debug flag. It's not going to actually run anything, but instead it's going to just show me what it would run. And we see here these update statistics comments, or sorry, update statistics commands, update statistics on the comments table. We see update statistics comments, my great statistic, and these spaces in between the words, right? So the problem here is that name isn't being properly escaped, so to speak, right? Because when we created it with brackets around my great statistic. Because we wanted to put spaces in the name because we're an end user. We let end users do stuff. They'll always come up with the most crazy thing that they can come up with. And it's not your fault, right? It's just the name of the game, right? We're always working against users. Everything would be easy if it weren't for users. So anyways, I'm gonna create another version of this stored procedure that I think is gonna solve this problem for us, right? So same kind of thing, just loop over all the stats. Only now I gotta surround the stat name with brackets, right? That'll handle stat names with spaces in them. right? So this is the store procedure that I'm going to use now that I think is more resilient to these kinds of problems. Okay, so are we back in business? Here's what the new store procedure. If I run that guy with the debug flag on, I see what it's going to run. This looks good to me, okay? Looks good to me. I think it's gonna work. So let's try it. Let's go for that. Again, it'll take about 10 seconds or so to do that. And then we'll see if it worked. It says it completed successfully, so I guess that must be great, right? If I go ahead and look at this thing, I look at these, whether these things were updated. Indeed, it looks like they were, right? Because I just ran this. It's about 6:28 right now, so this looks good. So indeed, my new store procedure is great. You know, I push that guy into production. I turn off my pager or whatever, you know, go out, get a drink, something like that. Everything looks fine, right? Until, again, we keep letting end users do stuff for some reason. So somebody comes along and wants to create another statistics. They call it my super great statistic. And you see there's all these weird brackets in here. You know, what are these people doing? We let them do stuff. When I try to run this, update stats, store procedure, it fails again, right? So again, we're thinking like, okay, dynamic SQL, very hard to write. Did I put the word statistic anywhere? I mean, I know I used the word statistics, right? But what is going on here? And this is part of the problem that I have actually seen people do in production. You know, I've never done it, of course. This is all just a friend of mine, totally responsible for problems like this. This is not good enough, right? Yes, this will handle stat names with spaces, but it won't handle stat names that have right brackets or left brackets already in them. So the question becomes, how am I supposed to handle these things? Okay. All right. So moving on, how are we supposed to handle those things? I'm going to tell you about the best friend to a developer who has to write dynamic SQL. That best friend is the built-in stored procedure called quote name. Okay, so you can see here, if I run this, it will take the string that I give it and surround it appropriately with brackets, and will also escape appropriately any right brackets that might be in there, right? So again, you want to pay attention to how long is this. That's for, if I'm using quote name, I need to pay attention to, oh dear, am I not, I don't have Zoom it turned on. Now maybe I do, hold on. Does this work? Yeah. All right, now I can't really zoom much further than that because of this laptop here, but you know, maybe
It looks pretty good.
Okay, thank you. If you can, if everybody can read that, that's great. So the thing that I'm trying to focus on here is that the return type of this thing is nvarchar 258, which in your mind might seem kind of weird. I think it's, you know, kind of well known that the longest name that that most objects, I mean, I'll just say most, I think it's pretty much every object, but objects in SQL Server, be it statistic or table name, index name, right? They're that sysname data type, and sysname is nvarchar 128. So you might be thinking like, okay, what is this nvarchar 258? How am I actually, you know, achieving 258 characters? What should I do when I'm writing code? If I'm writing code that's supposed to hold the escaped name of something like a database or a table or a statistic or any other object, I need to make sure that the data type of that thing is nvarchar 258. Another problem I've seen people have is like, they just say like, oh, I'm going to use sysname here. They're using quote name. It's great, but until those names start to get a little bit longer, then you get in trouble, right? You don't want to sort of silently truncate things. So you got to be very careful. So, I put this in here. How long is that? Because it really is 4 characters long, right? It's left bracket, HI, right bracket. if we actually want to achieve this limit, if we have something that is nothing but right brackets, 128 of them, then the escaped version of that with quote name would be 258 characters. So that is how you reach that limit. Can you name a table the name of 128 right brackets? Yes, you can. I have done that. I think we have that here as an example, right? Dumb table name. I'm going to actually create that thing. I'm going to insert some stuff into it and then run this. So you see, I was able to create a table with that name. That's 128 right brackets. I was able to put stuff in there. And it shows you right here, the name itself is 128 characters, but as you just saw on the other slide, quote name for that's 258 characters, right? 128 times 2, 256 plus 2 for the left and the right bracket there. So this is just, it's a digression. It's funny. It's like, who would ever name a table that, the thing about dynamic SQL that I hope you come away with after I'm done talking here tonight is really like, if you find yourself saying, oh, but who would ever, X, Y, or Z, you immediately have to code for that. That's how I feel. Because whenever I've said that out loud, it has almost always come back to bite me. So I should just always code defensively as you possibly can. And quote name is just easy pickings, right? It's the way to stop a lot of problems. So we're going to update our stored procedure here. They call this attempt 3 to use quote name instead of right brackets there, right? So this should supposedly handle any statistics name that I want. So I go back here. So now I think we should be safe if I'm using quote name. Run this with the debug flag. We can see here what's going on. It looks like that name is exactly right? My super great statistic down there. I'm going to go ahead and actually run it to make sure that something happens. Give it a second there. And we see everything was updated at 6:35. So indeed, this is working for us. We feel pretty good at this moment. Nothing too crazy there. Are there any questions so far?
Do you have anything from our chat, Josh?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. There's some law that you have to mention that XKCD comic for some reason whenever you talk about dynamic SQL. I'm not big on that guy, that particular comic, because it's just overused and I think people miss the point. One of the things that comic sort of just makes people believe is that, dynamic SQL injection is used, sort of only in destructive ways. I would say a bigger problem is that people try to use it to actually steal your data, right? It's one thing for like a hacker or some malicious user to come in there and just sort of mess your app up. I guess that's great. And I guess some people do that, but you sort of don't get anything out of that, right? Malicious users want to get something for their trouble. So one of the things that a malicious user might do is try to get data out of a table they should not be able to get data out of, right? So for example, some malicious user might decide that they're going to see if my store procedure is impervious to SQL injection, right? So what they're going to do is write a query like this, right? They're thinking my thing is not impervious to SQL injection. They think that they can actually get data from the post table if they pass in a table name like this, right? So we're going to go ahead and run this with the debug flag on, and we don't see anything pop out. So we think we're safe. And the reason why is because we passed the name of the table as a variable to a cursor, right? So this won't be a problem for us. People won't be able to do something like this as long as there is no table with that name, okay? So presumably, a malicious user can figure that out. So I'm just going to show you again right here. Here's this cursor. You pass in the table name. I'm passing that as a variable to a query. If there is no table with the name that you give me, I'm not going to find anything. So I'm not going to run any of my dynamic SQL that I've written down here. Okay. So a malicious user can figure that out. Malicious user decides, oh, all right, then I'll go ahead and create a table with that name. And then see what happens, right? So here we go. I've created a table whose name is this really funky string. SQL Server let me do it. So I guess it's out there now. So there won't be a problem. So we try this again. The malicious user is thinking this is going to work now. Again, completed successfully with nothing output, right? So this debug flag is showing me nothing is happening there. Now, why is that? Okay, again, if we go look back at the code, so now indeed there is a table with that name, but if there aren't any statistics objects on that table, then we're never going to get down here, right? Fetch next from the cursor, where fetch status equals 0. If I actually don't get anything back from the cursor, fetch status is never going to be 0. Malicious user figures that out, says like, oh, I guess I need a stat on that table in order for this to work. All right, I'll just create one. And go ahead and put some data into that column in that dumb table that I've created. I run that. There we go. So that SQL Server actually tried to create stats on that column. So now, right, as long as there is no stat, cursor doesn't find anything. So once the malicious user has decided that he's going to build a table with a nasty name, build a stat on that table, and put data into that nasty table, now we see with the debug flag on, it's actually going to try to run some code. Okay, this is the code it's going to run, update statistics comments. Now with nothing, with no other arguments here past the update statistics, it just updates everything, right? And then it will try to run this. So let's see. Does it run? What happens? Holy smokes, right? Start outputting stuff from the post table. Now, that is definitely not what I wanted my procedure to do. Now, if I've got this malicious user in my system, they figured out a way to get a stored procedure to do something it's not supposed to do, right? So now we're starting to get in some pretty big trouble. Okay. So I've got to fix my stored procedure, right? The thing is, I went in one direction. I did not go far enough, right? I was under the impression that it's sort of like, okay, in order for someone to actually inject SQL into this stored procedure, there needs to be a table that has a bad name that's going to be the code that they're going to run. That's only 128 characters. How bad could it possibly be? Well, as you see, I can output the results of an entire table. I think that's pretty bad, right? And the way that ownership chaining works in SQL Server, I might have execute on DBO, but I might not be able to actually read anything nakedly from tables, right? Unless that procedure itself is executing that. So you should be a little bit careful there. I need to go farther. I need to quote name the actual table name that's passed to me, right? This should hopefully prevent SQL injection, right? Again, quote name is supposed to be my friend. Let's find out what happens if I use this new version of the stored procedure, right? So the thing is, you're never safe from SQL injection based on your application. You should always use quote name. I don't care what you think your application does or allows. Code defensively. You find yourself in a position where people are executing arbitrary code on your database, even if it's just for kicks. This is the Stack Overflow database. They release it to everybody. This is not really a problem, but this is supposed to just illustrate an example, right? And now with this newly updated stored procedure that uses quote name everywhere where it should, we see that it actually now is doing the thing that I want, right? And we've officially thwarted this malicious user. When I run that, it completes right away because it's updating the statistics on that weird name, that weirdly named table. We can see it did just update them at 6:44 just now. So we have sufficiently protected this stored procedure against SQL injection. Again, it's just something to be very mindful of. Don't ever convince yourself that you're somehow safe based on what you think people are going to plug into your stored procedures. Always code defensively. Because when it goes bad, it goes really bad, right? So I'm going to go back here. I'm not going to blow this up again because that was causing me issues before. So long as it's legible now, we should be okay there. So what are we talking about? Use quote name, expect injection, test for injection, watch for long strings. So what am I talking about here? All right. So this is a lot easier when I've got audience participation, but maybe I can get Turner to be my guinea pig or something like that. How long should this string be, right? If I actually have this code that takes 2,500 Z's and concatenates it with 2,500 A's, how long should that string be?
I would say 5,000.
It should be 5,000, right? Like any smart person and any smart guy in the audience there is like, well, actually, whatever. But based on the way that this code sort of should work, the answer is 5,000, right? Now you can say something about, how Invoker Max, blah, 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 but if that doesn't matter to me, right? Relatively junior developer coming in, it's going to write code, might look something like this. Hopefully they're not releasing this garbage. This doesn't do anything. You should get 5,000. We don't get 5,000. Okay, we get 4,000. Which, if you are, thinking hard enough, you're like, oh yeah, because the largest an nvarchar string can be is 4,000 characters, right? Unless it's nvarchar max, in which case it can be much, much larger, right? So your junior dev comes to you, he's got this bug, he's saying to himself, what is going on here? I made this thing nvarchar max, I'm still only getting 4,000 characters. What is happening? Okay. It has to do with something called Datatype Precedence. And nvarchar max is actually different data type than nvarchar n. And when you concatenate things together, SQL Server takes the data type of the first element in the concatenated string and makes that the data type of the result. Okay, so what we actually need to do is something like this. This little trick here. Concatenate in an nvarchar max string that is just empty. Then when we add two 2,500 length strings to that, we'll see, and now I got to run all of this at once, so I'm not prepared. We got 4,000 for that bad one, but 5,000 for the newer one. And that's exactly what we expect to have happen, okay? So what you have to be careful about is your queries are going to be longer and longer and longer as time goes by, right? So you either know how long your queries are going to be or you don't. Depending on how they get built at runtime, you might be concatenating together like, the list of columns from a table, for example, because you might need to, update each column to be some specific thing. And today that table might only have 10 columns. Okay, well, tomorrow it might have 20. And a year from now it might have 50. And as time goes by, that's just going to get larger and larger and larger. Right, so you need to be able to code defensively against this. And here I'm just showing you this very straightforward query. Select top 10 star from DBO comments, but in between there, I've got 4,000 spaces. Again, that's just garbage, right? But it's just to illustrate if there was a lot of extra characters in this query, what would happen when I try to run it? And I get this failure, incorrect syntax near from. Now you can tell like, well, that's garbage, right? This is a legitimate query. This is legitimate SQL. What is happening? Okay. Well, we should use that convert trick that I just showed us above. Just add this guy in at the top of your query, and then we won't have a problem anymore. When I run this, it works, and I don't have to worry about it. Now, there's some more like advanced topic I can go into about what happens when you're using nvarchar max variable to store code that actually is not nvarchar max. Now, depending on what your SLA is for some of these store procedures where you have to write dynamic SQL, declaring a variable as nvarchar max when you don't have to add some overhead. Now that overhead is imperceptible to almost everyone all the time. But if you just are using nvarchar max everywhere for your code variables and not ever doing anything like this, then everything is effectively nvarchar 4000 anyway. So I leave it to you to sort of decide how you're going to do that. I personally like using nvarchar max unless I have an SLA that, where microseconds matter, and we do find ourselves in those positions sometimes. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. It's a much more advanced topic. I don't have a demo for it at the moment either. But I just wanted to show you this little thing. And Erlang has a really good example too, where sometimes you write queries that are almost, just one gigantic chunk of dynamic SQL, and you have to like concatenate in sort of like the name of the database that you're referencing or something like that. And then the whole thing just falls apart because you're not doing something like this to protect yourself against these long strings. So just be careful about that. These best practices here are related to that. How much more time do I have? It's like 6:51 right now. Are we on until like 7:15 or so? Is that right?
Typically it's 7, but we usually run over. So I'd say on average, 7:15 or so, but take however much time you want.
All right, I got another demo here. I just want to show some folks here about the plan cache and how dynamic SQL can sort of end up screwing with you when it comes to the plan cache. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out the cache. Don't do this in your production system if you can avoid it. But just here's a typical query. Someone might be writing some dynamic SQL now. Again, this is an example where do not write this in dynamic SQL, right? First of all, because you don't have to, right? You can just write this without dynamic SQL. But suppose that you have to write it in dynamic SQL because right here, maybe you have to reference a different database or something like that, right? So you might have to be like DB name right here. So you might write something like this because you have to write that in dynamic SQL. And Erlang has great examples about how this works. But anyways, we're just trying to keep it real simple. Like suppose this is written in dynamic SQL and we execute the code this way because we need to take in a user ID as a parameter, and we're just going to concatenate it into the string here. So ignoring for a fact that this has its own SQL injection problems, that's something that we could deal with on a later day, right? And we should be doing this, sanitizing the input, making sure it's actually an integer and not something else. We're just gonna go ahead and run this query. You see, we get, what we expect, top 10 rows ordered by nothing. It's totally fine. Look at what's happening in the cache. If I look in there, I see that here's that query that I just ran, use count 1. Sounds great. So let's run that a few more times. Do 10 more times to be precise. When I do that, right, it reused that plan 10 times. That's exactly what I want to have happen. Again, when you're in a position where sometimes microseconds count, you're not really able to recompile, then you want to be reusing plans in the cache. So what happens if I change, though, the variable, right? I want to get the same plan, right? So the comments table is just a clustered index on that bogus ID column that means nothing. So what I should get is just a clustered index scan with a filter, right? And like I can turn on the plan here if we want to just see what happens. And again, I'll zoom in a little bit. Right, clustered index scan with a predicate there. You see that? That's exactly what I want to have happen. There's really no other plan that can be chosen. So I want plan reuse. And the question becomes now, am I getting it? The answer is no, right? So I got this query here, 456 123. I got a new entry in the plan cache. Now, maybe it's not a problem, right? Maybe you say like, so what? Who cares about this kind of thing? Well, to me, I want to have a healthy plan cache. I want when a new query has to put an entry in the plan cache, something else might have to get evicted from the plan cache. That causes me problems. This is starting to show up as plan cache bloat in my mind because we don't really need 2 different plans for this guy. If I run it 10 more times, we see what's happening. Right? Now I've got, sorry, what did I just do? I ran the parameterized query. That's what I wanted to do. Well, that was a mistake. Sorry about that. Right here, I've got this plan. If I run this 10 more times, it's going to go back to using that other one. Right, and now we see that one was used 11 times now because I've run it 11 total times. This new looking query here that is parameterized, right, where user ID equal to user ID, I got 10 counts out of that one. If I even change that to 1, 2, 3, right, I run that 10 more times. Look at what's happening in the plan cache here. So yeah, bump that up to 20. And that's what I want. I want it to use this parameterized plan. And if I don't use parameters in dynamic SQL, then what I get is this bloated plan cache. And I'm not going to get plan reuse. Now you can also, we can have an argument about parameter sniffing, whatever. All right, well, stop writing queries that are so sensitive to parameters. How about that? Right, but there's give and take there, right? So if you've got a query that's sensitive to parameters in a different way, you can solve that. This is not a talk about parameter sniffing. This is a talk about dynamic SQL and what can happen if you don't write parameterized query. If you don't use parameterized query, you're going to bloat your plan cache. Depending on what you're using, depending on how end users are querying your database, that might be unacceptable. And to me, it is unacceptable, especially in a case like this where I know I want to use the same plan every time, right? So it needs to be parameterized query. And the syntax is a little funny, but I find myself when I get, I'm used to this kind of syntax now, you kind of got to redeclare all your variables, plug them in like this, excuse me. But once you get used to this, parameterized query syntax, it's really just, you know, it's second nature to me. And will be second nature to you too when you start writing queries like this. If you got queries where you know what the plan's going to be, you want plan reuse because you can't live with the seconds you're going to lose from recompiling a plan, and you
Oh, I think we may have lost you there, Jake.
know that SQL Server is just going to get all these, bloat your plan cache, evict good plans, what that is, down to dynamic SQL screwing with you, right? I'm sorry, was somebody asking a question there?
No, it was me. You cut out there for just a tiny bit.
Sorry about that. Oh, what's up? Yep.
No, you're good, Jake. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So anyways, like what I was saying was simply like, just be aware that when you're writing dynamic SQL, if you're using parameters, don't concatenate them into the query when you can avoid that. If plan reuse is something that you need for that query, okay? That is how you should take the lesson away from that. Now, I'm not going to talk too much longer. I'm going to leave you with this link here. I think you can just search for this guy's name and dynamic SQL, and this will pop up. Again, he rewrote this kind of right when I was redeveloping this this talk here. Is pretty awesome because I noticed that a lot of the things that I was telling people to do, Erland was also telling people to do. So I felt justified. You can see here, like there's just a huge table of contents here, everything you could possibly want about dynamic SQL. I'll say I don't necessarily agree with literally everything that is written here, but it is a great place to start. And if you read it and you want to argue with me about it later, I'm totally willing to do that with you. That's it for my content here. We're at 7 p.m., so I'm going to go ahead and just leave you with this slide here. Please hit me up on Twitter or on email if you want to talk more. I love talking about SQL Server stuff. I love being able to speak at this FoxPass, even though I have to do it from my own home and on a computer with no Bluetooth. It's still a treat being able to present for you guys. So I really appreciate your time. And if there are any other questions, I'm willing to hang around for as long as you have them. We can discuss it. But that's it from me. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for coming. We'll wait. There's a little bit of delay on Twitch, so we'll just keep the stream open here for a little bit, and then Josh, why don't you chime in after 30 seconds or so if there's anything. We'll go from there.
All right, great. Maybe somebody figure out what's wrong with my Bluetooth. When I open this up, like I don't see the turn on Bluetooth switch here anymore. And it says Bluetooth is turned off, and I don't know what's happening. So
Very weird.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need to update some kind of driver or something.
Your AirPods are charged.
What's that?
Your AirPods are charged. I don't know how they work. I don't have iPhone anything.
The AirPods are charged. My mouse is charged, and everything was working right when I connected, and I was trying to talk, and I couldn't hear me speak or something, and then it just stopped. I don't know what happened, but so.
All right.
So my mouse isn't working either. I wasn't able to plug in this external monitor, so it was a little rough, but I think we got through it.
Yeah, it looked great. Thank you for getting through all those technical difficulties to give the talk. I didn't know about that quote name function, so thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It is a lifesaver for developers. Got to write dynamic SQL. You need that guy as part of your rep.
Okay. So just for everyone on the stream, I don't think we have any questions right now, but you know, this will be available on YouTube. And then, like Jake said, reach out for any questions, and then reach out to us at fox@pass.org if you have any questions for us. Thank you again for joining, and I hope everyone has a good weekend. And yeah, thank you, Jake, again. That was great.
Yeah, thanks, Turner. Thanks, guys. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, you too.